朋友们，本期给大家分享一个重磅视频，两位对谈的嘉宾，一个是大家都很熟悉的米尔斯海默，来自美国的政治学者；另外一位非常让人意外，是俄国著名的政治学者杜金。有的朋友可能不了解这个人，队长简单介绍一下。这个杜金呢，他非常的有争议，他的成名作是《地缘政治的基础》一书。他在书中主张俄罗斯应该通过征服和结盟的方式，把欧亚诸国纳入势力范围，以对抗美国主导的大西洋主义帝国。而在他的书中，他认为对俄罗斯构成威胁的中国必须要进行领土解体分裂，以及政治和行政上的分治，尽最大可能被拆分。俄罗斯要把西藏、新疆、内蒙古、中国东北作为安全带，作为中国与俄罗斯之间的缓冲区，并且把这个安全带纳入俄罗斯的势力范围。由他的观点我们可以看出俄罗斯人的本性，那就是无尽的贪婪。周边国家只要他认为对他有任何一点的威胁，就应该想办法让它分裂，然后划出一部分作为缓冲区，或者纳入自己的势力范围，甚至成为自己的领土。大家想一想，这一番操作是不是非常的熟悉？当前的乌克兰不就是这么搞的吗？以乌克兰要加入北约为借口，吞并克里米亚，然后发起战争，试图拿下乌克兰。在失败之后，转而把目标调整为吞并乌东4州。一开始让这4个州进行公投，成为独立国家，之后也懒得装了，直接把他们纳入俄罗斯的国土。注意了，我只是在陈述一个事实，那些一听到对俄罗斯任何不利的话就气急败坏，污蔑别人是美粉、乌粉的人就是标准的金俄分子。在维护中国利益和维护俄罗斯尊严2选1中他们一定会毫不犹豫地选择维护俄罗斯尊严，哪怕会因此损害中国利益，也毫不在乎。队长的立场一以贯之，俄国、欧美、日韩那都是一路货色，都不是好鸟，而我本人也都很讨厌。我只在乎中国的利益和尊严。如果说杜金是俄罗斯的民族主义者，那么队长就是中国的民族主义者。如果中国当年没有搞定原子弹，没有通过改革开放走上富强的道路，只是一个软弱无能的大块头，那么今天很有可能我们面对的敌人就是俄罗斯，甚至我们已经丢掉了更多的领土。回到今天这个视频，杜金在视频中正面回应了他之前发表的中国分裂论。他认为当年俄罗斯刚解体很虚弱，中国站在西方的一边，是西方的盟友，所以也是巨大的威胁，所以他才会那么想。然后他又夸赞了现在的中国多么的强大，夸赞了中俄的友谊。看得出来这个老狐狸也是个灵活的变色龙。至于这一次和他对谈的米尔斯海默大家应该非常熟悉了，典型的冷战遗物、战争贩子。这2个人分别代表了美俄2国的保守派强硬分子。那么他们俩的对谈究竟会擦出怎样的火花呢？大家一起来看一看。
President Trump, throughout his campaign, he has said that he's going to resolve the conflict in a matter of 24 hours. Now, I understand that may be a figurative speaking, but what is the outlook for the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine right now?
There's no question that President Trump has said that the one issue area in the world, which is Ukraine, that he's going to really fundamentally alter American foreign policy is in that conflict. And as you said, he says he's going to shut it down very quickly. I do not believe he's going to shut it down very quickly. I believe he may have good intentions, but it's not going to happen. And the reason is that he would have to accept terms that Putin has laid down to settle this one that I believe no American president would ever accept. And specifically, Putin has said before he will even negotiate, this is to begin negotiations to come up with a peace settlement, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States and Ukraine have to accept two conditions. One, that Ukraine will never be in NATO, either de jure or de facto, that Ukraine will be a neutral state, a genuinely neutral state. And furthermore, that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Crimea and the four oblasts that the Russians have now annexed are permanently lost. They're permanently part of Russia. And again, Putin is saying, before I even begin negotiations to settle this, to come up with a peace agreement, you have to accept those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the United States, even President Trump, accepting those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the Ukrainians accepting those two conditions. Now, one could argue that President Trump is a very special person, and he has views that are outside the mainstream, and he is, after all, the President of the United States. But the problem is that he is surrounded by people who have Russophobia in the extreme and have been super hawkish on Ukraine for years. It's not like Trump is bringing into office with him a good number of people who share his views about shutting down the Ukraine war. He's bringing into power, as is very clear, a bunch of hawks. And therefore, Trump is going to be surrounded by people who are not going to want to accept the conditions that Putin has laid out. So my view as to what's going to happen here is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield. And I believe the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're in the process of doing it. And at some point, you're going to get a frozen conflict or you're going to get an armistice. And the end result is you're going to have bad relations between Russia on one side and the West and Ukraine on the other side for as far as the eye can see. I think this is a terrible situation, but I don't think that Trump is going to change things in any meaningful way and be able to come up with a meaningful peace agreement.
On my side, I can only agree totally with what Mr. Mearsheimer has said. And I would add, the situation is more radical that you have described because the conditions put forward by Mr. Putin officially don't correspond to the real intentions of Russian Federation. So that was a kind of minimal conditions that were put in the front precisely because nobody could accept them on the West. So in the reality, the situation with Ukraine is much more existential and important for Russia. We could not tolerate any kind of Ukraine hostile to Russia, any versions in any borders, inside any borders. The point of agreement, consensus inside of Russia that the war will lead with the West in the Ukraine should end with our victory and nothing less. That is not just the vision of Mr. Putin. That is the condition of Putin to stay in power and to save our political regime. So that is much more than just hawkish or imperialist reactions or desires or dreams or something like that of emerging once again independent power in the Eurasia. It is much more than that. So, and I think nobody in the West understands that correctly, because for us to be or not to be as Russia, as Russian Federation, means to win or to lose the war in Ukraine. That's much more than the conditions that Putin has put forward. And Mr. Mearsheimer has very correctly explained, and I agree totally with this opinion, that these minimal and unsupportable and unacceptable conditions that Putin has put forward, they have no chance to be accepted by the future administration of Mr. Trump.
You are a controversial figure in China, not just because your current reported influence in the Russian administration, but more for what you said quite a few years ago, some almost like 20, 30 years ago, that in your book you said, I may be paraphrasing here because of the translation, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you said, from what you see, China is Russia's most dangerous neighbor to the south, and it must be in Russia's interest to the maximum possibility be dismantled, China as a great power. And from that to what you've been talking about multipolarity, what explains your apparent shift in your ideology or your philosophy?
So it is not quite a few years, but that was more than 30 years ago that I proposed my geopolitical understanding of the role of China in front of Russia, and that was beginning of the 90s. So it is not quite few years ago. Beginning of the 90s, that was totally different situation. Russia crashed. Russia totally submitted to the Western globalist agenda, unipolar moment, and China, in our eyes, was the kind of accomplice, the power that has betrayed Eastern identity and joined globalization process in order to be the part of the global pro-Western system. That looked like that. Maybe I was wrong already in that way. I could not judge that, but that was the idea of how to consider China being the part of the West, being more and more involved in the globalist economy. And in Russia, present pitiful conditions under Yeltsin, and that was precisely some geopolitical vision of that. China being more and more involved in the West, more and more globalized, and Russia more and more losing its sovereignty. So that was a kind of geopolitical despair, I would say. And the thoughts like that, they belong to this epoch. When I've tried first of all, when Putin came to power, and second, when Xi Jinping came to power, we, in my eyes, in my Russian patriotic eyes, the situation was very, very different. So we see Russia returning to the global politics, maybe, as Mr. Mearsheimer has said, at third rank, far distant third pole after United States and China. I agree. I don't argue that we are number one. Maybe we are number three, but we are number. We are not nothing. We are number three with nuclear weapon. Number three, it's something. It is not nothing. So, but I agree, that is not about that. And from Putin's time and from Xi Jinping time, I have, and most of all after visiting, thanks to my friends in China, visiting China, teaching in Chinese Institute and Fudan University, and making contacts with different Chinese thinkers, I have arrived more than 20 years ago. It is not few years ago. So more than 20 years ago, I have arrived at the conclusion that China represents the main strategical ally for Russia in constructing multipolar world. And from that time, that is more than 20 years, or maybe more, I started to revise my previous geopolitical attitude of the age of despair of the early 90s. So many times I have explained that, but globalists, they are playing their game. They starting to cut some expressions and terms from previous without context of previous texts, and in order to destroy our relations. So I would say maybe I am not the only one who has changed this. That is much more important than myself. So I am not the only one who has corrected the attitude to China in a much more positive way. When I started to learn what China is, I have totally changed my opinion. So I think that I have missed the point in China, in Chinese involvement in globalization. What point I have missed? I have missed the point that China is still the great power, very national-centered society with the deep Confucianist ethics, and it could not be just socialist as in the West or capitalist. It is something Chinese. We need to understand, to get deeper and exploring the Chinese identity, to understand its behavior, its psychology.